We have 3 members of the Texas House of Representatives join us. You can see their full bios in our live event program. Thanks to Clearwater Underground Water Conservation District for sponsoring that. So Andrea, how are we doing on getting our legislators ready to go? Welcome. All right, fantastic. And I did get a call from our third representative, Representative Murr. He was on a Zoom court hearing that hasn't quite wrapped up. So he may be dropping in after we get going here. But I just would like to first introduce our panel. We have Representative Lucio III from District 38, who was elected to the House back in 2006. We have Representative Cody Harris from District 8, who was elected back in 2018. And then joining us shortly will be Representative Murr from District 53, who joined the House and was elected in 2014. Welcome and a huge thank you for joining us at, I think, what is both of your first Texas Groundwater Summit appearance.
Thank you very much. Honored to be here.
And Representative Lucio, do we have your audio on as well?
How about now?
Yes, we do. Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you. So
age doesn't necessarily equate to technological savvy. So please forgive me.
My kids can attest to that. Like I said, this one is always an audience favorite. Hearing from our legislators. What I was hoping to do today is start by just orienting our audience to you and your districts and kind of groundwater and how it relates to the issues happening in your district. Then have a little bit of a discussion on some bills from past sessions before we talk a little about interim work, and then end with a discussion on priorities, both groundwater and non, for the 87th legislature. All right.
Great.
So Representative Lucio, why don't we start with you? Your district covers part of Cameron County. You don't have a groundwater conservation district down there, but you have been active on groundwater issues pretty much since you joined the legislature. Why don't you spend 2 minutes sharing a little bit about your district and groundwater?
Sure. You know, we get our water primarily from the Rio Grande River. Our issues right now and the stress behind those issues are having Mexico deliver the water it's supposed to as per a 1944 treaty. We do have brackish desalination projects, some of the first in the state, some of the more larger projects in the state. When I first got to the legislature, had family friends, even my father-in-law who had experience in the area of water, who suggested that I try to be a voice for South Texas. There wasn't anyone on the Natural Resources Committee south of San Antonio. So I tried to do my best to get on those committees. I was able to achieve that in my second session, spent 5 sessions, 10 years on the Natural Resources Committee. This past session was the first I hadn't been on it. I just got reelected for my 8th term, but it was an area I spent a lot of time on, was intimately involved in the creation and then monitoring of the SWIFT program. Work closely with several commissioners now at the Texas Water Development Board and TCEQ. So I've learned as much as I think I could have learned and will continue to learn about water. And it's just something I'm passionate about, and it's a good bipartisan issue. So it's great to be involved in the subject matter.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It is not an RD issue. It is something that matters to everybody. Representative Harris, how about District 8? You've got GCDs covering 3 of your 4 counties. Could you take a few minutes and talk a little bit about your district and how that relates to groundwater?
Sure, you bet. So my district consists of 4 counties, and partly in Central Texas and partly in East Texas. And so in East Texas, we have an abundance of groundwater. We kind of have the opposite problem that Representative Lucio has. And we're, I would say, more in a defensive posture towards the urban areas, looking for water to supply their population. Well, we have it, we don't want to give it up, so that's kind of the mentality behind it. It was such an honor to serve on Natural Resources Committee this session, and what a learning opportunity it was. Previously, before I was in the legislature, I was involved in the Texas Agricultural Lifetime Leadership Program through the Texas A&M Extension Service, where water and groundwater issues were really exposed to me for the first time, where I could see the effect across the entire state and the country as well. In Texas, we think we've got issues with groundwater, but it's not just us; it's across the whole country. And I think we have a real opportunity to lead on how we solve those issues. And no better person to be leading the committee than Lyle Larson, who knows more about groundwater than pretty much anybody else in the state of Texas, in my opinion. As a freshman in the legislature, I had 2 bills before the committee, and one of them was actually opposed to one that Representative Lucio had. But what a great experience it was, and Representative Lucio was very gracious. He's been in much longer than I have. He could have easily railroaded my bill and just gone on past me, but he did. He sat down, we brought the stakeholders together, and he helped me through that process, and I was able to learn a whole lot from that. So looking forward to next session to continue to learn, to continue to help the entire state as a whole figure out how to move forward on groundwater issues.
Well, Representative Harris, you just provided the perfect segue into what I had next that I wanted to visit with you both about. One of those 2 bills that you authored was a House bill that dealt with the service area. 2122, I believe, was the number on that one. And that one sought to take away the discretion that some districts who permit based on tract size or acreage had to consider the service area of a retail public utility. So could you just kind of speak to the concern that you were getting at with that bill and why you thought that approach made sense to address that concern?
You bet. Yeah. And the approach and the perspective was from the viewpoint of the landowner and the in theory, the groundwater owner, even though the overseeing authority is the Groundwater Conservation District. From the standpoint of the landowner and rural utility services, coming in and using the water that they may not own, how it was basically a beginning of the discussion. In my opinion, it's probably been going on for a long time. But how do we balance the landowner rights with the need to provide water, and then having a bill that was pretty much diametrically opposed to that? It provided a lot of opportunity for really good discussion on the whole issue. We didn't really get anywhere with it, but the discussion was beneficial, in my opinion, if not from anything more than the standpoint of a legislator understanding how many different sides to an issue there are and how much you have to take into consideration when you're looking at issues like this.
Thank you. And Representative Lucio, as Representative Harris mentioned, you had a bill, same title, same provision, of course, that you were seeking to change. And I think you'd filed that bill actually in a few sessions prior as well. Yours was HB 2249, I believe, but that one sought to take that discretion that districts have and make it mandatory. And I was hoping you could speak to your perspective on that issue and why that's something you've been working on for the past few sessions.
I really appreciate that a large majority of the groundwater conservation districts are operating fairly, equitably, and providing a great service for their constituents. I firmly believe that. There was attention drawn to a few situations where water supply corporations, who are a critical partner in the water industry, in the water field, to provide homes and businesses with water, were having to purchase acreage in order to qualify for their allotment of water from groundwater conservation districts, which, as you understand, would pass that expense along to consumers who, in many of these rural areas, are of humble means and have limited ability to pay, for any additional unnecessary expenses. So what we wanted to do was create a system where, if it was being used for, water supply corporations supplying homeowners, supplying small businesses, that it would be based on use and it would not necessarily be based on acreage owned. It's complicated. Water is, groundwater and how it's regulated very differently from neighboring groundwater conservation districts is challenging, and how to create some uniformity while at the same time allowing for local control is an important factor moving forward session after session after session regarding policy. I would love for the stakeholders to come together and determine a path forward, whether it's over time or through consensus building, where Cody and I don't have to have these conversations and we can worry about water, quantity moving forward and building infrastructure and all those things. But, you could have a large rancher or a large water stakeholder who's has footprint over 2 or 3 groundwater conservation districts, and each one of them operates very differently. And so it becomes challenging and, makes the work Cody and I do very interesting.
And Representative Lucio, correct me if I'm wrong, a few sessions back, were you involved in a bill that would have allowed a landowner to petition if they were in multiple districts to kind of consolidate into one?
As Cody will know, the more time you spend in the legislature, the more brain damage you get. It sounds familiar. I've worked on enough policy now that I couldn't tell you the specifics of maybe that bill, but I do want some consistency, especially if I am a large landowner, right? Rancher. I just finished Yellowstone, the series. I don't know if y'all seen it. It's amazing. I just finished. I'm all caught up, but it makes me appreciate the ranching right now, and I have an affinity for ranching at the moment. But I have my small businesses, I have my law firm, and I like to operate under a certain set of rules that's uniform to my entire operation. I can't imagine with something as vital as water on my one operation or my one responsibility having very different regulatory structures.
Thank you for that. And so Representative Harris, another bill that you filed, and the word petition, again, we're creating all these natural transitions. I love it. The other bill that you authored last session had to do with a petition a landowner could make to the district to require them to consider undertaking a rulemaking. Could you share a little bit more about that bill with us, the background and what you're hoping to achieve there?
Sure, that was House Bill 2123, and the idea behind it is pretty simple. And where you have a groundwater conservation district who pretty much operates as a quasi-governmental entity that with oversight and regulatory authority, but there's no mechanism, broad mechanism in place where the landowner or someone that's subject to that groundwater conservation district can ask for a revision. The bill does not require the revision. It just says the landowner can petition the groundwater conservation district to consider a change. And it's as simple as that. There was no requirement to implement it, to enforce whatever the proposal was. It was just basically giving a voice to the landowner, in a greater voice in the groundwater conservation district process.
Mm-hmm. So, when we were working on that bill last session and I was talking with our constituents, which are GCDs, one of the things I think a lot of them mentioned was that they do, informally do this all the time, and they feel like they have an open door policy and try to work with landowners who have issues. And so I'm wondering if, are you seeing a problem specifically, or is this something that you just want to take an informal process and make it formal? As
Representative Lucio said, the vast majority of groundwater conservation districts operate very well. They do things the right way. There have been outlier issues where I think landowners felt that their voice wasn't being heard. That what you just described is not taking place, and so it was trying to address those issues more than the ones that are doing it right.
Thank you.
And if I could just contribute to that, as Representative Harris, well, sometimes there's such loud voices on these outlier issues that it sparks at least the conversation of legislative action. And what is happening in maybe an isolated part of the state becomes a conversation as to a proposed policy change for the host state. So, you know, the best you can as a responsible stakeholder in this process to reach out to your partners on your side of this stakeholder issue and just say, hey, let's all do our best to avoid the attention of the legislature, the better off you're going to be. What I tell people is do the right thing, get along, and we'll never hear about you. And you don't have to come to the Capitol and tell us why what we're proposing is good or bad or indifferent.
Thank you for that. And Representative Lucio, something you mentioned earlier that I was hoping to talk a little bit about is brackish groundwater. You've been, like you mentioned, involved in that. And last session, Chairman Larson had a bill that set forth a special permitting process within brackish groundwater production zones. And that had been something that had been talked about for the last few sessions. And I know you were a co-author back in the 85th legislative session on that, but weren't on it this last session. I was just curious if you wanted to share your thoughts on brackish groundwater development and specifically that groundwater, you know, those production zones and the special permitting process there.
So Lyle is one of my favorite people on the planet. I absolutely love that man. He's been a good friend. And I think he is spot on wanting to innovate and continue to look to the future for additional groundwater, or additional water sources. Things like, you know, injecting water into water wells and being able to reuse it, recapture, stuff with, like you say, brackish desalination and how important that is for future growth. Now, there are some areas of the states that are ripe with water, like Representative Harris's area, but a lot of areas are growing so fast, like the Rio Grande Valley where I live. And when we have dependence upon Mexico for water deliveries, and we really can't get the IBWC to enforce those deliveries, we find ourselves sometimes in times of drought in really tough circumstances. So if we're not developing alternative sources for water, then we're not minding our responsibility and being good stewards of our community so that farmers, ranchers, and municipalities have the water they need. Now, brackish water may be expensive to develop now, at least in the United States, but water desalination, whether it be seawater or brackish water, is very common in many parts of the world, including Israel, which seems to have the best model. They went from being 80% deficit to ripe with water by building 5 of the largest seawater desalination plants in the world in vital or I guess key points of their country, and then developing a very elaborate piping system to take it everywhere it's needed. You know, we created a special code in the water code for seawater desalination, because although we may think of it as, you know, an expensive kind of outlier source, put it on the back burner proposal for water production, it won't be long until we have so many people in the state of Texas that our traditional sources of water resources are inadequate. And we really need to focus on innovating, developing, so that there's no hiccup or fumbling in the transition to those new and additional water sources.
Thank you for that. Representative Harris, would you like to talk at all about brackish groundwater development or any of the other topics that Representative Lucio touched on?
I completely agree with Eddie, and you know, moving forward as a state, I think our focus should be on developing alternative sources of water, and that's something that I'm still learning about. You know, there's that being on Natural Resources Committee and being under Lyle Larson's leadership on that, you get a very thorough education on the opportunity that exists and the challenges that are there. And so I think it's a great issue because it, as we said already, it has nothing to do with party or partisanship. We can all agree that we need to be laser focused on the future of Texas, and the population explosion in Texas is going to require more water. So if we don't have enough on the surface or in the ground that's usable, how can we develop water that is? And we've been focused on that as a committee. And moving forward, the more legislators that we can educate on this issue, the better it will be.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I've heard, a lot of people say Lyle Larson has been such a leader in water that, it's like we need to just spread that knowledge even further amongst some of the other legislators as well, because he has done such an amazing job of filling that space.
And if I could say one thing, and Cody, you're a young member, you're the future of the legislature, but he has developed the model for being a subject matter expert. And I wish we're in different times in our lives, right? Lyle and I. But he has put the time in the interim to travel to every area of the state and out of state and internationally to learn about every possible issue pertaining to water. He is on a first name basis and has a cell number of multiple water stakeholders in my community, which most chairmen I've served with have never even been to the Valley, right? So if there was a model, script to follow as a young lawmaker on someone who wants to be a subject matter expert, whether it be water, healthcare, whatever, Lyle has developed it. He has developed a template to do it. And like I said, he puts in the time and the work, and there's no way around having to do that in order to be as knowledgeable as he's become on the issue.
I'm chuckling because I think people would suspect that we planned this. Every time I'm getting ready to move on to a subject, one of you provides the perfect opportunity for us to move the conversation that direction. Thank you for that. You make me look good. So next, I did want to move into the present and interim efforts, and the fact that this interim, we haven't been able to do the same sort of work and connecting, meeting, studying issues with everything that's been going on. It's been like no other.
Right.
And hopefully it's the only time it's ever like this. But what I would like to hear from you guys is what have you been, to the extent you've been able to, what have you been working on in the interim? What are you hearing from your constituents? How are you going about connecting with them during this last number of months? Representative Harris, why don't we start with you?
I'll touch on the connecting with constituents first. As I'm sure y'all know, it's very different in different parts of the state. Whereas if you look at Austin and their response to the pandemic, and you come over to Palestine, Texas, it is so different, so different. I mean, we still are around each other, we're safe, but we're not as fearful as a lot of the state is. So staying in touch with my constituents hasn't been that big of an issue since we came out of the shutdown back in March, May, around that time. But it has made focusing on interim issues more difficult, in my opinion. I know, and we'll go back to Chairman Larson and how he's been leading on the issue that Representative Lucio brought up in the water that we are owed from Mexico. I think that's been Representative Larson's or Chairman Larson's biggest focus so far that I've seen throughout the interim is trying to find a way to make Mexico live up to its obligations for the benefit of the people in the Valley, not just the Valley, but other areas of the United States as well. And so I guess that's kind of my answer to that question.
Thank you for that. And welcome, Representative Murr. So glad you could join us. This is just what it means to be a legislator who has to keep, 1 or 2 full-time jobs on the side, practicing law and being on Zoom hearings. So appreciate you joining us, Representative Murr.
Thank you, Leah. I apologize for my tardiness.
Oh, you're not tardy at all. You're multitasking in a way that is admirable, definitely. So we were talking about the interim, but before we go on with that conversation, Representative Murr, I would love to just give the audience an opportunity to hear a little bit about your district. We started off talking about, just giving an orientation, 2 minutes to your district and groundwater. You've got a 12-county district, I think, with 11 GCDs out there. Do you just want to take a couple minutes to talk about that?
Sure, happy to. So this might bore Representative Lucio and Representative Harris a little bit, but the 12 counties that I get to represent combined add up to about 15,000 square miles. which is larger than 9 U.S. states. And so when you start thinking in terms of groundwater, we are in the Texas Hill Country, parts of West Texas, and parts of South Texas. And depending on where you're located, oftentimes use of the land, whether it's for agricultural, recreation, or a lot of hunting, does depend a whole bunch on groundwater. And I grew up in a world where groundwater is so precious that we weren't allowed to water the yard because our water well was weak, and you kind of needed to bathe and to make sure the livestock have something to drink. So whenever you think in terms of that, the other challenge that I have with our location is a lot of our oil and gas activity out in West Texas results in interconnectivity with Central Texas, the coast, and production facilities from Corpus all the way up to Crescent to the Houston area. We have seen over the last few years pipelines, whether they're natural gas or oil, we've seen a proliferation of moving that product through parts of our 12 counties. Now, in places that have experienced oil and gas production, that's a familiar process. But in areas where we don't see oil and gas production a lot, we have experienced a lot of landowners dealing with the concerns that they might have with tainted groundwater, with boring challenges, both with surface water and groundwater. And with karst limestone formations that you see in the hill country, you can see a transition from a clean environment to a dirty, contaminated environment very quickly. One popular issue that we've had, which I think should be considered by policymakers, is when we're looking at, say, a new pipeline coming through, and the processes allow it to go across private landowners. If there's ever a complaint for an existing pipeline, one that's actually out of circulation, or a new one, it is very difficult for that property owner to go back to a state agency and then try to get the responsible party to take action if there is a minor or major spill, which might result in groundwater contamination. And so I've gotten a lot of phone calls from constituents who've either voiced that concern or actually experienced that. And they said, wow, this system is not well designed to be user-friendly from a property owner standpoint. And whenever you think about property owners, we always tie groundwater to ownership. And so if you're worried about the quality of your groundwater, state policy has not made it very easy for you to turn around and say, hey, responsible party, I have a concern. Can you help me take steps to mitigate that? And so I think that's something we've been experiencing a lot in our region of Texas.
Thank you for that. And that was actually, you touched on something that we wrapped up our conversation about kind of work in the last session, but one of the issues you were really focused on was some pipeline and eminent domain type issues, and also aggregates, I believe, was another concern in your district that has that groundwater nexus and something that had been a focus of yours. Do you want to just speak to that for a minute, or anything else from last session to kind of catch people up?
Sure. When we talk about the aggregate concerns, a lot that we've seen are starting to pop up along river waterways or in riparian zones. So it does have a surface water relationship as well. The experience has been, one strong example would be that an aggregate production facility actually acquired property right next to the city of Kerrville, was ultimately annexed, and now, because they were grandfathered, are operating their production facility inside a municipal city limits. And while they may be taking best practices seriously and involving those in their day-to-day operations, there's nothing in state law to put best practices in a place where we can make sure that bad actors follow those as well. And so one concern that I've always had would be, it plays out, and over the course of 30 or 40 years, a smaller outfit shows up to purchase or acquire it, and then when they're done, they don't follow best practices. Adjacent property owners' values are affected, groundwater and surface water could be affected because those aren't followed. And so that has been one avenue that we've worked on, is simply to say, hey, this is the industry's best practices. Why would that not be good policy for us to implement to require all those that operate aggregate facilities to do the same thing? But there is a fear within the industry that something turns into a runaway train when you hit the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate and amendments start flying. That is a realistic fear that any industry has, and so they do have a lot of pushback on any new regulation that might pop up. That's to answer your question about aggregates.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So we were, as I mentioned, we were talking about the interim, and Representative Lucio, kind of going back to that question, in this strange world we're in right now, how have you been kind of doing what you need to do in the interim? What have you been working on, and what are you hearing from your constituents?
Are you
Yes,
back to me? Okay.
Please, thank you.
And Andy, I know I missed your call yesterday. I tried to call you this morning. I know you were in court. I just heard that, so I'm sorry we couldn't connect yesterday.
No worries, but we'll talk later. It'll be great.
Yeah, man, that's an awesome mustache. I'm jealous, man. That's
He's
legit.
not telling the truth because he was in court changing his name to Andy Wyatt Earp Murr.
Ah, hey, that's strong.
It's my Corona stash. So
2020 has been a tough year. It's been a tough year. We had, my father and I had tough campaigns. We survived them. Then right after my campaign, I thought I'd come up for air, and then COVID hits. I'm in an industry that was hit really hard. Although I'm a lawyer, I'm in my law office right now. I'm in the fitness industry. I own a few Orange Theory fitness franchises, and that was one of the industries hit the hardest. And having to navigate those matters, though, gave me a lot of personal experience with what small business owners go through. And hearing from them and advising them on the PPP loan process, the SBA EIDL loan process, what local governments were doing and how that impacted restaurants and bar owners and small businesses, even, medical practices like dentists, and how, they would have a different set of local regulation on what they could do or not do, or the capacity in one town and different in another. So, I think that's the beauty of the Texas legislature, is that we're a part-time legislatures, and guys like Cody and Andy and I have to go make a living and experience the pain points that our constituents do. Very different than Washington, where they're full-time lawmakers, and they spend enough time there, they lose some perspective of what it is to just be a regular business or professional, right? It has been difficult. A majority of my focus has been on COVID. Our area was hit extremely hard. One of the highest hospitalization tests, positive tests per capita in all of the state of Texas. Trying to get our community the resources that they need, respirators, additional hospital beds, transition facilities. But I have to compliment the governor. I really do. There are some people in my party that are being really hard on him, but he has reached out. His staff has reached out. I saw him in a room, no cameras, no nonsense, with local elected officials that needed resources, and he wasn't playing around, and he was allocating those resources. So I'm thankful for his leadership. It is not difficult. No matter what you do, it's either not enough or completely the wrong thing to do right now. No one is happy with whatever action we're taking at any level. It is a hard time to serve in elected office. And it has been a tough year. The other issue is dealing with online instruction versus opening campuses. Half the teachers telling us, I don't want to go back to school. It's very dangerous. I have a pre-existing condition. And the other half of the population telling me, I need you to open school. I'm a single mom. I don't have anyone to help with my kids, or we don't have the infrastructure in our neighborhood for online instruction. It is a difficult time. So I hope that this session we'll all be really focused and tuned in on focusing on the core issues that are important to our state, that are bipartisan, that Cody and Andrew and I all share in common, because it is going to be a very, very hard session.
Thank you. Another one of those segues, but before we do that into talking about the next session, Representative Murr, I'd just like to give you a minute to speak to, the challenge of doing that study and interim work that you would typically do, and outreach to constituents over this interim, and also maybe speak to what you're hearing from your constituents and their concerns as it relates to groundwater or other issues.
I could take a lot more than just a few minutes, but I'll try to be concise. I would say as far as interim work, we have all relied upon technology as a vital component to allow policymakers to communicate and to communicate with the experts that normally would provide testimony to interim committee hearings, as well as with those constituents that want to meet. One thing that we revitalized in my district office, and if you'll recall, 100 years ago, when folks built homes, you had a formal living room, you had a formal dining room, you had a formal kitchen, but you also had what they used to call the parlor. And it was an upfront meeting room. And if y'all all remember it, we always shook our head and said, well, nothing ever happens in that room. Well, now it does, because when folks do want to meet face to face, we're able to set up our office like a parlor with chairs around all four sides of the room and enough sufficient distance between us that we can be in the same room and share concerns and ideas. And so we've been using that to a great extent with constituents, some of whom are very concerned about COVID or have pre-existing conditions, like Representative Lucio mentioned. As far as groundwater goes, we've seen in the Hill Country additional development. We keep adding people to the state of Texas. Everybody wants to come here, and I'm very proud of that fact. But in the Texas Hill Country, it continues to grow at a very phenomenal rate. We will have to revisit that during redistricting as well. But as far as that, there's always a process with developers of where does that water supply come for whatever development they're putting in. And we have seen longtime landowners who are descendants of folks that have been there for generations suddenly become concerned about the value of their groundwater and their access and frankly, the cleanliness of it. Assertions have been made for greater responsibility of river authorities over the tributaries that drain into the rivers, because for all practical purposes, surface water regulation at the local level is supposed to be done by the state, but the state has finite resources and can't always be there. And so that's something that I've had constituents press upon. They've also been concerns about how groundwater permitting and modifications or amendments to those permits apply when you look at current or future development. And that's challenging because we've created districts based on political lines, and sometimes those developments will fall right there in between them. And so it'll go one way in one jurisdiction and then a different way in another. But all in all, I think we all recognize, but we certainly overlook the fact that groundwater and surface water are managed separately, but we all understand that their relationships are much closer. And so I would engage with policymakers for any opportunities where we can make river authorities and groundwater districts have an environment where they can work together, not adversarially, not territorially, but because a lot of these projects involve both surface water and groundwater, yet we don't necessarily see everybody being on the same page. And so that's challenging for an adjacent property owner who's really concerned.
Thank you for that, Representative Murr. And I do want to now shift into the 87th legislative session, 4 months away. Pre-filing starts in 2 months. And what we've all been hearing about is COVID and the budget, and COVID and police reform and redistricting, and COVID and the budget. Not a whole lot about groundwater, but I do want to hear from each of you. And I'm going to kind of make it a two-part question, just because we're getting a lot of great questions from the audience I want to save time for. If you could speak to your priorities for the 87th session, and then specifically to groundwater priorities. Representative Harris, why don't we start with you?
Start with the new guy first, huh? Going into my second session, I had these grand ideas of how great the second session would be. Then COVID hits, and now how the whole process works is all up in the air. And I just listened to another webinar where Speaker Pro Tem Moody was addressing this same issue. And I thought what he had to say, I'll just kind of echo what he said. He was talking about how the whole process itself is designed almost intentionally to where bills fail instead of pass through. And so you compound that with the unknowns and the challenges that next session is going to bring, just with the budget and redistricting alone, not adding in what other House rule changes we may have to protect everyone from the virus. But you know, I think our priorities this time should be on the basics and not a lot of outlier other things that we might have time for and room for in a quote unquote normal session. But we've got to focus on the key business of the state and making sure that our communities and have the resources that they need to get through the next biennium, and not a lot other than that, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And do you anticipate that you might be refiling some of the groundwater bills you had from last session, or is groundwater in that maybe it doesn't need to be on the table this go round?
As Eddie mentioned earlier, we need to continue to have these discussions every session. So I haven't decided whether I'll file the same bills or not yet, but if it helps continue the discussion, sure, I'd be glad to. Be glad to do that.
Thank you. And Representative Murr, why don't we go on to you if you could speak to your priorities broadly and then groundwater priorities for the next session.
Well, I have, like everyone, you know, I have a lot of goals and we set high standards for ourselves. But practically speaking, if you look at the statistics, about 80% of all legislation does not pass. And so I know at the completion of every session, I like to look back and see what the success rate was. And typically it's somewhere between 17 and 21%. When you talk about groundwater, though, something that we've explored last session, and we have a dispute between two neighboring counties, and it has to do with the use of surface water for a river that naturally does go under the rocks and come back up a few times. And so a shell that needed to be considered for everyone, so it doesn't happen without basically consent of all those involved, is to model something on a unique animal, which I also have in one of my counties that I have the privilege of serving, the Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District. So this is a shout out to them. And we don't see a lot of combination surface and groundwater districts that also have the ability to raise their funds. So, you know, many of our groundwater districts have taxing authority, but our surface water entities at the regional or local level don't necessarily have that. And I think it's really, we owe it on like a 10 years trek as policymakers to explore if that is a future option for certain river basins where we may want to merge folks together where they can then in a more unified manner conserve the resources that we're limited on. And I think you're going to find that that's applicable in some regions of Texas, and then in some areas it doesn't work that way. And so I'm really eager for us to sit down and roll up our sleeves, because I think there's really some opportunity there to model a new creature if that is needed. Some of our groundwater districts do a bang-up job, and I'm really proud of that. And I think that the state doesn't recognize the work that they do, or the fact that they have a lot more local input than if that responsibility was placed on a regional or a statewide agency like the state does for some. So I'm kind of proud of the fact that we still elect folks at the local level, just like that district I mentioned, they still elect folks. So it's the only river authority where you have local elections, and I think that speaks volumes. I like to talk a little bit about notice provisions that we see for surface water rights whenever the state comes in and try to decide if it is state water or private water, because TCU doesn't know if it needs to be involved, if it's public water or not. And I think I've been filing that every session to no avail. But at the end of the day, both of these gentlemen have mentioned, we're going to have a lot of noise in the room, and the bandwidth for considering a lot of policy, it's going to be fairly narrow, because with budget implications, the impact of COVID, redistricting, it's going to be hard for us to have serious policy discussions about other parts of the state. So it's tough. And I'm also open-minded, and I have more constituents that are meeting with me every day about other ideas.
Thank you for that. And then Representative Lucio, if you'd like to share with us about your priorities and any specific groundwater priorities for the next session.
So I serve as the chairman of the Texas House Committee on Insurance, and it covers every form of insurance you can fathom, you know, from healthcare insurance to title insurance to windstorm insurance, on and on and on. And I didn't realize how many forms of insurances there were until I became chair of that committee. We're going to have our hands full regarding how COVID has impacted healthcare costs in the state of Texas. I also serve on the Public Health Committee, so that there's some, you know, continuity there. That's going to be a big issue. One of the things we worked on bipartisanly last session was surprise medical billing, and we're already catching wind of folks who went to a hospital thinking they were covered because of COVID-related issues, and then come out and get this surprise medical bill from certain providers that were providing services in the hospital but weren't within the hospital's network. So it's going to be really complicated when it comes to that issue. I want to focus also on rebuilding the Texas economy. We lost so many small businesses, some that have been open decades, generations, and how we support and rebuild our Texas economy is really important to me. You know, there is some federal aid, and you know, it wasn't administered, I think, as well as it could be. And I say that only as a small businessman, completely bipartisanly. And what can Texas do to be a backstop to what SBA's jurisdiction is? And you know, right now I'm expanding my business on one of the brands that I operate in. I'm going through the SBA process, and it is very convoluted and it is very hard. And that's because I'm married to an accountant who does all my books. I can't imagine someone who didn't have, you know, that resource available to them. Regarding groundwater, is with a guy like Lyle, who is likely to be chair again, he's going to run that committee at full tilt. I'll tell you, regardless of the issues we're having with COVID, I promise you guys, he's going to keep you all real busy, because he's just a dynamic individual like that. So we'll have those conversations. Now, what happens once they get out of that committee and to calendars and then getting them on the floor, that's a different matter. But, you know, I love the Texas legislature. I not only grew up around it, but now having served for 16 years there, it's a great place. And it's still a place where Democrats and Republicans can come together and develop amazing friendships and do the work for the state of Texas. So we'll have opportunities to have meaningful dialogue, and we will pass some water bills, whether they're related to groundwater or not. So we'll be ready. These two gentlemen will be ready. We're going to go up there and do the work for the people of Texas, without question.
Thank you so much for that. So like I mentioned, now I'd like to take a few audience questions with our remaining time. We have about 7 minutes now, looking at my clock. Here was one that came in that I think is pertinent to all of you in the districts you represent. The state tends to focus on the need for water in our urban populations, but the Texas budget is based on revenues from oil, from agriculture. You know, what can the legislature do to transition the focus and importance to support rural Texas more, and the industries that are driving our economy? Representative Murr, maybe I'll let you take that one first.
When we talk about the impact to the state, it's very difficult to put in perspective because we only look at what's going on through the lens of where we live. And when you talk about state policy, we try so hard to make it uniform, but Representative Lucio, he lives in an area where a different kind of agriculture happens than happens where I am. You know, I usually get 30 or 40 freezing nights every winter. Y'all don't want any freezing nights down there. And then over in the eastern part of the state, y'all have trees a lot taller than the rocks that we grow. But at the end of the day, agriculture and energy production still leads the way in generating the income stream that the state probably relies upon to such a degree. The only thing that we omit from that is sales tax, because sales tax occurs where the people are spending. Buying and spending occurs. And so, urban and suburban areas, you're going to see a focus on that. You're going to see some legislation follow up with what the controller's office identified as some issues with sales tax, because for one store in the entire state, wherever the sale occurred, it was attributed to a single location in Texas. And so that means that local government got the benefit, and none of the other locations in the state derived any benefit from that. I think that will be remedied during the next session. But when we talk about budget, you're right. It is hard for someone in one part of the state to always see eye to eye with someone else, because we only view it through how it affects our communities, and that's where we are. And so I think at the end of the day, the only benefit we have is the great rapport, where Chairman Lucio and I can visit at length about nearly any issue, and we're able to do that with all of our colleagues, because that's the only way that you do it for the betterment of Texas. So
thank you for that. Representative Lucio, would you like to share any thoughts on that?
We all have our constituencies to represent. We should lead with that without question, and each one of us has a unique district we represent. But, a lot of us, like me, have kind of combined districts. Even though part of my district's very urban, a lot of it is still rural, right? I have a school district that 40% of its students don't have reliable internet access. And I have a lot of farmers. Citrus farming in the Rio Grande Valley is a big industry. And, so I can relate to both rural Texas, and oftentimes it's not a debate between Democrats and Republicans. Sometimes it's a debate between rural and urban, but everyone should bring their perspective. I think that's how the dialogue best occurs and compromise is forged. We serve with a lot of great people, the folks that get criticism and get talked about in the press as having controversies. That's a fraction of the people actually involved in either local or state government. There's a lot of good people that are trying to do the right thing, even when it's hard, right? Doing the right thing is most important when it's hard, and it's going to be really hard this session. I think urban Texas is very well represented. Some of the most dynamic, knowledgeable, most experienced legislators are from rural Texas, and a lot of our speakers, a majority of our speakers, historically have not been from urban areas. So I think rural Texas is going to be well represented as well as urban Texas is going to be. Texas appreciates everybody's participation in the future growth and success of our state, and we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Texas is going to come out and it's going to survive the session, and we're going to survive COVID, and we're going to be better for it.
Thank you for that. Representative Harris, do you want to add any thoughts on that one?
I agree with what both Eddie and Andy said about it. It's a great question, by the way. What made me decide to run was being in California and seeing how the San Joaquin Valley, where you've got 80% of the country's agricultural production in edible agriculture, in foods and plants, they have become so overregulated, not because of the way they vote in their rural areas, but because the urban centers have grown by such a huge extent in the legislature that you had people from San Francisco and Sacramento and Los Angeles creating policy governing what they do in the rural areas, painting with a broad brush. And so having an effective voices from the rural areas of Texas in the Texas House is incredibly important to protect what we have. And so just like Chairman Lucio said, the fight often is not so much left versus right as it is rural versus urban. And it's important for us those of us who are on different sides of the aisle, to have relationships with the guys who are like-minded on issues that we can agree on, like water, to be able to do what's best for the state of Texas. And so I look forward to it next session.
Wonderful. Well, we're just about out of time, and I want to give each of you just, if we got a question to this effect, and I'm going to pose it kind of as a closing thought. What should GCDs be thinking about? What would you like them to be focused on? And if you could just try to keep it to a sentence or two or three, we'll maybe use that, like I said, as our closing. Would you like to start, Representative Lucio?
You know, let me just give a small, concise perspective. Is y'all know your issues better than we do. And you know the difference on some of these issues with stakeholders that might think differently than you. Start that dialogue now, try to create some consensus and bring us a solution. That is the best way to make a difference for your stakeholders. If you come to us without starting that dialogue, it's very hard for us to resolve the matter and get a bill that we could all consider and support in the time frame and attention span that we have during session. So I know it's hard, but try to build consensus now and present us something that we can work on collectively once session starts.
Thank you. Representative Harris?
I agree with Chairman Lucio. You know, there's even being in one session, I recognize that the same issues kind of raise their heads every session, and every time the interested parties act completely surprised that it's again being talked about. And I'm not talking about groundwater conservation districts. I'm talking about other areas that I noticed that. But for groundwater conservation districts, if there are areas of concern that you saw last session, let's begin discussing those and coming to an agreement before the gavel bangs to start session, so that we can move the ball down the road.
Wonderful. And Representative Murr, we'll end with you if you would like to share some thoughts on that.
Thoughts on GCDs? Generally, they always need to remember that most legislation is filed because it is a reaction to something. And so I encourage GCDs to be proactive in anticipating future policy issues and trying to tackle those with their rulemaking authority. And occasionally you'll find a GCD that does something strange or weird. Well, that anomaly is typically what's going to provoke or encourage some attempt to make a fix at the state level. And so as entities, there's nothing wrong with rallying around together, brainstorming, because y'all are the troops on the ground. You're dealing with the issues day in and day out. So you have firsthand knowledge of it. When you encounter one, your creative solutions can be the fix, or sometimes they can trigger the response at the state level if there's not a solution that's ever proposed. So just be wary of that, because GCDs can always take the bull by the horns if they want to, and steer those policy discussions, but they got to be proactive, not reactive as well.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. This has been an honor and a pleasure and such a great discussion. Really appreciate you being here, bearing with us on a virtual platform. I hope someday we'll be able to host you at one of our live events. Again, thank you, and thanks for your service to Texas.